Hi, everyone. I'm Josh with Josh Wright Piano TV. It is my pleasure today to be interviewing Graham Fitch. A lot of you probably already know him. He needs no introduction. He's done so much wonderful work online on YouTube. As you can see, I mean, he has a great performing career as well, but he's done a lot of amazing things with Pianist Magazine, and he has his own channel. So I'm going to link that in the description below. But let's welcome Graham, and I would love to start out with just a little bit about your background, when you started playing, who your major teachers were, and anything else you'd like to share on those lines.
Great. Hi, Josh. Wonderful to be here. Thanks for the invite. Yes, well, I started very late. I didn't start until I was about 12 and a half, 13, it's kind of late to be doing what I'm doing now, but I'd always had that passion to play. We just didn't have the piano at home. We didn't have the resources to get lessons. So I started kind of late. And as soon as I started, the blinkers were on. That's all I wanted to do. I always say to students, if they're sort of thinking, shall I go for a career in piano or not? And I'm thinking, well, the decision has been made for you, because I don't think it's something that we decide. It's something that it calls us. So that kind of vocational calling was there. So then I went to the Royal College of Music. I had some wonderful teachers there. And then I ended up coming to the US on a Fulbright. I had 1 year at Peabody, where I studied with Anne Shine for 1 year. And I believe it's her 80th birthday celebrations going on right now.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yes, an amazing pianist and just a fantastic person. And also in Leon Fleischer's weekly classes for piano majors. And I learned so much from him, incredible inspiration. And I'm still sort of feeding off that now, all these years later. What he said at those in those classes is still very much front of mind. And then I went up to New York to study with Nina Svetlanova, and I was with her for I don't know, 6 years probably. And during that time, I had some wonderful lessons with Julian Martin, who actually I studied the Taubman principles with him, because he was working with Dorothy Taubman at the time. So we kind of cross-fertilized a little bit there. I also had some lessons with Andras Schiff in the wake of a series of masterclasses he was giving. So he invited me to come and study with him. I wouldn't say it was studying with him. It was more several kind of wonderful experiences where I'd play for him and he'd give me some thoughts. And then, anybody I've missed out, Peter Feuchtwanger. I don't know if that's a name you know. He's kind of a guru status. He's passed away recently, but maybe one day I'll show you his special exercises. He has a series of exercises that people do, and they're kind of a little bit arcane, not standard exercises, kind of the opposite of what you think of as technical exercises.
Could you share really quick how you spell that last name, just so everybody on this video can look that up?
Sure, Feuchtwanger. So that's Feuchtwanger.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Peter Feuchtwanger. He was a German living in London for a long time, and I'd studied his exercises with him, and that was very kind of changed a lot. That did change a lot. So I had a kind of a mixture of influences. Of course, the last great teacher I had was Nina Svetlanova, who's still very much around in New York, still very much teaching and working with pianists in her. Well, let's not talk about age.
Well, that is, wow, that is an incredible pedigree. I mean, I can't imagine, that many wonderful principal teachers. I mean, I've had the opportunity to study with 3 amazing teachers, and then do master classes with many others like Fleischer, Garrick Olson, Babayan. I've done actually private studies with Babayan as well, but those continued studies, that's incredible. So thanks for sharing that. One of the things that my channel focuses on, as you know, is piano practice methods and techniques and tips and tricks to kind of, not take a shortcut necessarily, but to improve the efficiency. So for every one of you guys watching, I've asked Graham today to just compile a small list of exercises that he finds extremely helpful, and I'm looking forward to learning from you as well today. So, however you want to take this, I'm more than happy to. We're all excited to go through all of these. So, thanks for being willing to talk with us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Josh. Yes, great. What I've got is a stack of stuff around me. And I think because we'll be chatting, won't we? It won't be just me talking. We'll both be chatting. So, I'm not going to get through all of this. But I know you asked me to bring up some sort of exercises and things, technical stuff for the levels, elementary level, intermediate level, and advanced level. So I've got a few of those things. But in terms of practice, I think there's one thing that I noticed that people don't really understand is how to practice. They just think it's a matter of putting in the time and sitting there for hours. And the problem with it, of course, comes with, well, how do I fill in 4 hours? And then you've got the sort of archetypal time fillers, which is sitting there with a metronome. So I've got a thing against the metronome. I really, I sort of eavesdrop outside institutional practice room doors, and I can always tell those that really don't know how to practice when they get their metronomes out, because they sit there for hours with their metronome. They put it on at 60 and they play through at 60, and then they put it on at 65, and I'm sure you can identify with
yeah,
that.
I actually, in preparing for this interview, I was watching a few of your videos, and I got a kick out of that one where you're like, okay, 60, 65, 70. Okay, now
Yeah,
2 hours are done. I'm done. So,
and of course, another thing that people do is just to go through endless hours of Hanon, which I've never done and I've never been a proponent of. But I do have one thing. I don't know if this is visible on the screen. It's my little practice flow chart. Is that vaguely visible? I can send it to you if it's of any interest. I can tell you sort of what it means.
yeah, absolutely.
It's really a way of structuring the practice. So what you do before you do anything, and that could be before you repeat. Let's say you repeat a phrase. Because haven't you heard this too? People just bang away until they get it right. It's like trying to defeat one of those aliens on a video game, bang, 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 zap it until you've got it, and then you move on. What
Absolutely.
is you practice? You practice getting it wrong 9 times in a row and correct on the 10th attempt. So what are the chances of it coming out right the first go through in front of an audience? I mean, slender. So the idea here is that you let me hold this up so people can see, you make a decision about what it is you're going to do in as specific detail as possible. I'm going to play through the first movement of my Beethoven sonata with no stops or whatever it may be, or I'm going to play through the exposition. Or, you know what I mean. So you've got a definite. I'm going to play through this one phrase and finesse that one phrase. Then you actually do the thing that you decided to do. Then afterwards, and this is where people don't sit and evaluate. I don't think people reflect on what they've just done because they're in such a hurry to play again, get back and do it again. So they'll say something like, oh no, that was rubbish, or they'll say, no, not quite, bang, back in again, without stopping to figure out what it was that didn't match what they intended. So the idea of this, it's a sort of a plan, play, judge process. So then if you can see, yes, I was happy, what I played was what I intended to play, and I was happy with my result, then decide, do I need to repeat it? Because a lot of times people repeat. Why repeat? I mean, you may want to repeat it to make it a more habit, because nobody formed a habit by doing something just once. But if you're not happy with it, rather spend a moment and actually jot down. If you haven't done this before, write down on a piece of paper or in a practice diary, if you keep a practice diary, what it is that you want to repeat for. What is it you want to improve on the repetition? In as precise terms as possible. It might be the left hand in the third bar was uneven, or it might be I wasn't happy with my pedaling. So before you replay that, you have a new intention box you put in here. You don't have to write it down; it happens in the head eventually. But you put down exactly what it is you want to do on the next repetition. And I have found that a very sobering way of practice, because it makes you really aware of what it is you want to achieve. Because a lot of the time people sit down to practice, they've got no idea what they want to achieve. They just want to fill in the time.
Right. I think that's so important. I tell my students all the time, they say, what makes up the best student? I say generally the most curious students are the best students because they want to know how to do it. So they'll be persistent with it. Obviously, hard work is imperative, but being the best diagnostician is part of being a great pianist. And that's exactly what you're referring to there is I think it's so important for students to know to pinpoint, oh, I messed up in bar 5. Well, let me start at bar 1 and I'll just hit bar 5. Well, no, why don't you just start
Yeah,
right there and start working at it? So I love
absolutely.
that.
Absolutely. And to figure out, how many times do you need to repeat something? Do you need, after you've done the practice, do you need to play through your piece? Because I have noticed this, you know, slow practice is one of the things am a great fan of, but not just in and of itself. It's got to be followed up by other types of practice because you can be sitting there practicing slowly from now till Christmas and get no closer to being able to play it at the tempo. So, I just think it's a lot of the time when I look back on my background, I had two teachers who were very hot on asking me how I was practicing when I presented with a problem. So there was me going in for my lesson expecting, oh, I'm having a difficulty with this, expecting them to wave a magic wand over me and, show me exactly how to fix it there and then. No, the question was, how are you practicing? And I would have to come up with a pretty sophisticated list of what I was doing, not, oh, I'm kind of doing it slowly, because usually when you ask somebody to demonstrate slow practice, it's not slow at all. I'm sure you've had that same. I mean, are you a fan of slow practice, or are you one of those? Because it's quite polemic, isn't it? This slow practice business.
Oh yeah, I'm a huge fan, and I completely agree with you. Slow practice can be therapeutic overall, but without a direction, slow practice is literally just filling time.
Mm.
Additionally, I think that slow practice should be a means to an end, as you're saying, and there is a time and a place for fast practice. And I like to,
Yeah.
especially with problem areas, I will take a part, get it. We you would refer to Taubman, and I did the Robert Dorso Taubman interview, and that got me thinking a lot. And I've actually applied this a lot in my own practice. If you're practicing, like right now, I'm relearning the Opus 10 number 8 etude and just kind of observing how the hand moves in a slow
Yeah.
tempo in the most relaxed manner. Then when you get up to those fast tempos, that is ingrained into you. So I think slow practice is a way of ingraining something properly, but then you have to depart from that. And I also like to oscillate between slow and fast practice even
Yeah.
after it's been good at a fast tempo. So I totally agree with you. I think it's
Yeah.
valuable for everybody here
You,
listening.
you mentioned that etude. I mean, if you do it too slowly, what value is there in doing that? Because the movements that you're using for that are different, aren't they? You'd want to get to there quickly, wouldn't you? So I could imagine that being very useful practicing groups where you're stopping on the, say, the shift, the movement. And actually, I watched Robert D'Urso's interview. I thought it was fantastic. One of the best explanations of the Taubman technique I've seen. Really, really, really excellent. So, I mean, I feel that as a rotation across my thumb. But if I'm sitting there practicing that slowly like that, I'm not going to sense that thing. You know,
Exactly.
and I was working with somebody earlier today. I had a long teaching day, so I'm a bit
Oh,
exhausted.
well,
You've
thanks
caught
for
me at the
making
wrong
time
end of
for
my
us.
day. But I was working with somebody on the Rondo Capriccioso, Mendelssohn.
Mhm.
And, I could feel what they had been doing was they'd been practicing it slowly, but they'd been moving slowly. So we went over a little bit, just the movements are super fast here. So every time I move from one position to the next, I'm really fast from one spot to the next. So the tempo is slow, but the movements are quick. And then, how much of that is valuable? A certain amount. But then I would kind of immediately want to get into the chaining, just taking little snippets, that, and finessing that. And then adding, and then tiny little bits at the tempo.
Absolutely. And I would just love to add here, for my audience, because we talk a lot about that adding on technique, often working from an ending point and then working back towards the beginning point is also equally as valuable as working forward. And if you want to be thorough in your practice, you should be doing both directions, forward and backwards, because it gives you different perspectives going both ways. I think they're equally valuable. Sometimes it's easier for a student to work backwards because they're always finishing. I am a big fan of that, but going forwards is equally as important, I feel like. So
no, I totally agree, Josh. I do the same thing. I call it backwards chaining, which is, it sounds a little suspicious, doesn't it? Backwards chaining. It sounds a bit dodgy, but you know, they know what I mean. And I'll just say, let's backward chain that, and they have to start literally from the arrival, and then the note before the arrival, or it could be the measure before the arrival, or the unit before the arrival, the hand position if you want. So yeah, I mean, I'm such a great believer in doing fast work in little tiny chunks.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Yes. I would say, and I would venture to say, of any practice method that I have ever learned, that chaining that you're referring to is a great place to start, but it also is kind of the fix all type method, because I always make a joke on my channel, hey, even a monkey could do this. So with all your human intelligence, you can do that or this. I remember I was playing that passage of the Samuel Barber second, it's been so long, and there's that little passage, Devilish, that goes, and he keeps somewhat shifting the pulse, and I think it's in 5/4 at that point. I can't remember exactly the details of it, but I remember specifically I said to my teacher, I think I was in my master's program, so I knew all the correct ways of practicing. I said, I've done my rhythms, I've done finger staccato, I've done different types of touch, I've done slow to fast, and she said, how much add-on or chaining have you done? And I said, oh, I forgot that one. And yes, those 2 weeks of intense practice on that probably helped it come quicker.
Yeah.
But within 20 minutes, it was there. And I was just like, oh my gosh, okay, I've got to remember that one, because that is so imperative to success. So thanks for sharing that.
Absolutely. When I was a student at the Royal College of Music, we had one professor there who did not allow his students to do any slow practice at all. They had to go straight in at the tempo, but one or two notes. In other words, he only did chaining. He didn't believe in slow practice at all.
Interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
I can see how that could be an effective method. I still like slow practice, but yeah, I see where he's coming from.
I mean, I think when you're practicing slowly, you've got time to think about every note before you play it, and to judge the tone, to know whether you're using the right finger, to listen to everything. And yeah, there's so much that's polemic, isn't it, in our profession?
Absolutely.
Do you do exercises? Do you not do exercise? I've got a bunch of exercises. I don't know if you want me to move on to some.
Yeah, let's move on. That sounds great.
I mean, we could chat about practice till doomsday. I mean, it's one of the things that I'm very, very interested in, because just before we do leave the subject, I had somebody that came to me for a few lessons who was a very keen amateur pianist, and he came to me. The first thing he said, I can't do the minor scales that begin on black notes, the harmonic minor scales. I've got real technical problems with them. And I said, okay, just play us one, and F sharp minor, I think it was. And sure enough, he couldn't play it at all, but I didn't believe that it was a technical problem. I just asked him, could he play that scale with one finger? In other words, did he know the map of the scale? No, he couldn't. So if he can't see the design of the scale, how can you possibly ask your servants to execute that? In other words, to go around the course of that scale, if you can't see it. So I have found an awful lot of people come and they complain of a technical problem. It may be a technical problem, but a lot of the time it's a perceptual problem. They just haven't understood what the passage is, what the design is. So I said to him, okay, next week, what I'm going to do when you come for your lesson, I'm going to ask you to play all of those black note scales just with one finger. You can choose which hand you do it with, right hand, left hand, whatever it was. And he came next week dutifully, hadn't touched them in any other way, he just did one finger. And then I said, now let's try F sharp minor. And of course, it came out like a breeze. So what was the difficulty? Was it a technical difficulty? Not at all. So, I just often will ask people how they're practicing. Can you play the left hand by itself? Can you play the left hand part with the right hand? And it was, how well do you know it? And
Absolutely.
a lot of the time they don't know it well enough. They haven't digested it. They haven't perceived what's actually going on in the music. So we'll talk out aloud. We'll sit and they'll describe the patterns. I call this PPR, personalized pattern recognition. It's a sort of analysis thing. So we just talk it out as we go. There's a whole step. There's a seventh. We jump a seventh. That's a chord of the whatever it may be, just so that the music filters into the brain rather than just this sort of fixation on technique, which is a kind of mechanical thing.
Absolutely. That's such an important point for everyone to remember, is that technical issues are generally solved through expressive means or logical means. I mean, just thinking through simply, I've had a mental block for many years with double thirds, with the traditional fingering of the Chopin 1 3 5 2.
Oh yes.
But finally, I just figured, I'll change my fingering a bit. I'll think about it in a different way, because sometimes we ingrain such negative thoughts surrounding something that a mental block is there, but you can logically kind of talk your way out of it. So I think very wise. So
yeah, what fingering do you use for that? So the traditional being 3 1 5 2, yeah.
Yeah, so I use two different fingerings. I use either 4 2 5 1, which seems like it would tangle you up, or 3 2 5 1. And for my hand, for some reason, that works well. It's still a work in progress with 1 3 5 2. Maybe one day I'll get it. If you have any gems, you can share them here. I'd love it.
It's just a nasty etude, isn't it? It's one of the scary things. But I like what you said just now about ingraining thoughts, because there was one time I was practicing a Beethoven sonata, and I remembered that I'd forgotten to phone somebody. I thought, I'm right in the middle of my practice, and it was an obsession. That phone call was in my head as I was practicing. So I had to interrupt my practice, and I went and phoned them. And then what happened the next day? I got to that same spot in that Beethoven sonata, and that person's name popped up into my head. Just because there's an association now with that measure of the Beethoven sonata and that person. So if my background thoughts are, this is really difficult, this is really difficult, it's one of the most difficult studies in the world, and double thirds are hard, even if I'm not completely aware of that thought, maybe it's an unconscious thought, maybe somebody's told me, maybe a teacher has told me, or a peer has once told me, I'm going to be ingraining negativity in my practice, whether I like it or not, whether I know it or not. So,
yeah, I totally agree with that. I remember I was doing a master class with a woman, and I had learned the Gaspar when I was 13 or 14 years old. And this woman said, well, why would your teacher ever give you something so difficult? No 13-year-old can play this properly. Well, by the time I was 17 and 18 years old, I was winning competitions with that piece because it was so seasoned. But one thing that my teacher was so wise, she never told me that it was one of the hardest pieces ever written. She just said, yep, you're ready for this piece. Let's move on to it. And I thought, okay, I mean, this is tough, but if she thinks I can do it, I can do it. And so I think that self-confidence that you're referring to and negativity can polarize a student towards success or failure. If you think, I'm never going to get to this level, well, you may not with that type of attitude. So I think that's invaluable. Even though it's a simple concept, I think everyone listening to this needs to remember that. So thank you.
There's a lovely quote by Henry Ford. I think it's something like, apologies if I get this wrong, whether you believe you can or whether you believe you can't, you're right.
Love it. Yeah.
Yeah. It just says it, doesn't it? So, what goes on in our head, the inner voices that go around. And of course, the teachers are largely responsible for that, because the student will emulate what goes on in a lesson, will model what goes in a lesson. So if the teacher is endlessly negative, which a lot of teachers are, because a lot of teachers seem to think it's an ego trip to sort of squish down a student like this, you know, that negativity, it gets embodied by the student, whether they like it or not. If they're sitting on this piano stool and you've got a negative influence coming from a teacher, that is toxic to the whole process. And of course, it happens all without consciousness. Nobody's really aware of it. The teacher's not aware of it. The student's not aware of it. Then they come up with all these tensions that are sometimes mental tension. Of course, mental tension translates into physical tension. There's the two things that kind of have. Well, I think it's a Buddhist saying, isn't it, that the body is just the heavy part of the mind.
Oh, brilliant! I haven't heard that one. Love
That's
it.
it's a good way to think, because otherwise, you know, people blame tension on bad technique, which it can be, of course, but it can be anxiety. I mean, for me, anxiety is just mental tension, and because the mind and the body are so interconnected, if you've got mental tension or anxiety, it's going to go somewhere in the muscles somewhere. It's going to come out in the playing.
I completely agree, and that's a good thing for students to remember about their performing. Oh, I played it perfectly at home, but as soon as I got in front of you, I didn't play it as well, or this audience. It's a different environment. You have to simulate those environments, but you have to be able to center yourself back to that comfortable spot if you want to play your best. So really, really nice advice. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of practicing, before we go on to everything else, just if I could just add one more thing, which I think is really important and really neglected. You've got practicing, which often involves stops and starts and, you know, finessing and obsessing about the left hand or about the pedal in any given spot. Then you've got performance, which is non-stop. I mean, there's no way you can obsess about anything in a performance. You've just got to get out there and do it. But people don't practice performing. I've noticed this. They don't practice their performance from start to finish. So I've kind of got three areas that I don't know, labeled. So you've got practice, that's obvious. Performance, that's obvious. Practicing a performance is an area that people don't engage in enough. So, you know, if you're going to play a program, a recital program or a diploma program, whatever it is, you've got to be practicing when you're ready to play the thing, when the thing's kind of taken shape. You've got to be doing that kind of regularly, starting from the beginning of your program, going right the way through to the end of it, no matter what goes wrong, no matter how unhappy you are, because you might start your first piece and realize, oh, that's much slower than I wanted. I know, I'll just start again. In a performance, you're going to get that thought that says, that's not quite as I want it, and you're going to have to fight the reflex to want to stop. So you've got fighting going on, mental fighting going on. And I've seen the results of this all too often. Wonderful pianists who don't know about practicing a performance, who come a bit unstuck with just that one element.
Yeah, it reminds me of a story. One time we were in Sergei Babayan's studio, and he said, some student brought up Daniel Trifonov, and he said, how could you ever be jealous of that lifestyle? It's just so tiring. It's awful. The only thing you could be jealous of is that he is so hot with his performance abilities because he's doing it every day that you become fearless. And but it is like a muscle. But performance, as you're saying, it is a muscle that can dwindle. I mean, I even just look back at my most recent performance. I performed 4 concerti last year. This year, I've only had a handful of performances. And this last performance, I was like, whoa, I'm kind of cold, you know, like I need to, you know, start doing practice performances before this big performance. And so I did, and the performance went well. But if I hadn't done that preparation, it's something that weakens if you don't keep it strong. It's not, oh, I used to perform all the time, I'm good. It's something we have to maintain constantly. So
absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I always talk about performances being like it's an organic thing. It's like a garden. So you could get your garden up to the most fantastic level, and you know it could be a show garden. And then the day after the judges had left your garden, the serious gardener would be out there again gardening, because it never stops, does it? You never stop gardening because it's organic.
absolutely.
Just like that with our playing, like that with our piece. If we haven't played a piece for a few weeks, I mean, I wouldn't want to sit here and play a piece that I haven't practiced for a few weeks, no matter how well I know it.
Exactly.
Things will have slipped, you know. It's just what it is.
Maybe you know this quote. I think it was Rubinstein. He said, um, if I don't practice for 1 day, I know. If I don't practice for 2 days, the conductor knows. And if I don't practice for 3 days, the audience knows. Is that right?
Yes, I know exactly what that. I thought it was Horowitz, but it could be Rubinstein. I don't know.
It's probably Horowitz. I just, it's somewhere back in the recesses of my mind. So awesome. Well, I'd love to see some of your additional practice tips here if you want to transition
Well,
those now.
yes. What I've got here is I've got a list of stuff that I'm kind of not always sticking to. Why don't we go to some of the exercises, some of the technique stuff that I've got up here? Can I show you these?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, I'm not a great fan of Czerny and all of that stuff, particularly. I'm not a believer in sitting there for hours doing Hanon. I think Hanon can be useful if it's done well. I mean, let's say you're trying to show somebody a wrist circle in a particular piece, and you want them to move in a certain way. Why not just go to something like Hanon and just put it in a circle? Just use the pattern. And I sometimes use scales for that purpose. So, somebody came the other day and they were playing the first arabesque of Debussy, and they were struggling a little bit with the twos against the threes. So rather than fix the twos against threes in the piece, what I suggested was that they practice a scale. And I'm even using a little pedal. I'm even using a tiny bit of pedal of the sort that I would use in the Debussy. So
Wonderful. Yeah, I'd never thought of doing a scale in 2 against 3. And by the way, viewers on my channel know that I'm not a fan either. I've done tutorials on Hanon and Schmidt and Czerny and all the scales arpeggios, but every one of those videos has a specific purpose. Today we're learning about rhythms. Today we're doing, like, now we can add 2 against 3. I hadn't thought of doing that with a scale. It actually sounds quite nice. Today we're doing different touches. Today we're going to work on slurs or accent work. That's so important to remember that it's not a means unto itself. So thank you.
Yeah, well, that particular Debussy thing, because anybody playing at that level should be able to play a scale of E major, wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely.
I'm remembering Alfred Corto's advice, which was study not the difficult passage, but the difficulty itself reduced to its most elementary principles. So if the difficulty is 2 against 3 between the hands, and they're looking up at the page and they're playing something with complex patterns here and crossings here, why expect them to be able to do that in the complexity of the music when they can't do it in a scale? So I would suggest starting with a scale. It could even be slow, and then get that in the spirit of the piece.
Absolutely. And something I want to point out that Graham is doing so well here to everybody watching is he's also inserting expression. As you could tell, he's starting with a rounded sound. It's not ba da da dam bum, because if you practice it like that, that's going to translate to the Debussy. So thank you. Yeah.
Absolutely. But I mean, I use scales for things like, the pathétique when they get to that, whatever this is, that second theme. Sorry, I have to fast forward till I get to here. This. If they're struggling with that, and often people do struggle with it because they're too scared to release the keyboard, I will just get them to do a scale with those notes, and if they're still scared to release the keyboard, transpose up and down a bunch of octaves.
Brilliant. Yeah.
I just find using things like scales, which everybody knows, as vehicles, as kind of contraptions for solving a particular problem, I find that very helpful in a lesson because it can be done really quickly, rather than thinking, oh, I've got to be doing a whole lot of exercises to strengthen my forefinger because it's weak.
Yeah.
And it's not weak if you're using your forefinger, you're aligning up on it and you're dropping in and releasing. There's nothing weak about it at all. Funnily enough, I had that the other day. Somebody came along and brought a Beethoven sonata. I'll show you in the right hand. It was patterns like this, and she was not moving. So because she was not moving, she was experiencing weakness in her fourth and fifth finger. And her first words to me were, "Oh, I must go and do a whole lot of exercises to strengthen my weak fingers." And I said, "No, do none whatsoever. Just move behind those two fingers." And as soon as I showed her the movement, whether you map it this way as a kind of, wrist, lateral wrist, or whether you map it as a circle, or whether you feel the rotation from 5 to 1. I mean, there's several different ways of sensing that pattern of notes. As soon as she'd sensed what was right for her, after we'd experimented for a few moments, it was like the penny dropped. No, she didn't need to go away and practice exercises at all. She just needed to find the right way of moving across the keyboard, and bingo, there it was.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've noticed, and just to expound on that a little bit, I've thought a lot about this. Why do students struggle so much in stretched out passages? Like that etude is a common one, or if you're just playing arpeggios. I mean, try to play everything at an angle like that. It's such an unnatural thing, and you can't. When you're twisting, you cannot employ your arm weight in an effective way. So everything you're saying is getting back to the fact that once you have a very basic strength at the piano, I mean, you can play your 5-finger patterns with clean releases. Really, the sky's the limit, because now you have the tools, the basic tools. I mean, there's a lot of specialized techniques that we can get into, but that is something I want everybody listening to this interview, get back to the basics of, hey, how is my arm weight translating down into that fingertip? And do I feel that strength there? And there is no reason that your fifth and fourth finger should be weak, because you're employing the exact same arm weight into that fingertip as you are one of your strong fingers. So,
I mean, when I landed my fifth finger, I don't feel weak at all. And if I look down, I can see that my arm is behind my pinky. Well, the same with the fourth finger. I sometimes use this example from the Grieg nocturne. My alignment is over 5 and 3, and now it's over 4 and 2. Now it's over 3 and 1, and I'm just moving between those 3 positions beautifully. When I say beautifully, it feels beautiful. It feels lovely. It feels, yummy, as it were. But if I fixed my hand, this top third is going to be really weak, because it is weak. Not that my fingers are weak, but my position is weak. I'm favoring my thumb. Who needs to put a thumb alignment there? My thumb's strong enough as it is, so I'd rather align on here and feel strong. So alignment is one of the big things for me.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that translates into really tough things, like I was talking about double thirds, or even something like this. Something like that. If you have your hand locked, there's just no hope that you're going to be able to execute those types of passages. It has to remain loose.
Yes, absolutely. And with that's a particularly nasty thing, isn't it? That nocturne. I mean, I try and map that with it. I call it my breathing wrist. There's a little bit of upward, downward motion there. I don't know how you deal with that. But I wouldn't want to do it from my main knuckle. I would feel very weak if I were lifting from here.
Can you expand on that a little bit? Because that's a tough passage that I'm still currently kind of working out. So would you go down with the first one, up, or would you go up, down, or experiment with both? What do you do specifically there?
Well, okay. So what I would do first would be to drop into each one. I'm not going to use this movement. I would drop into each one, then I would drop into every other one. So hinge up, hinge down. And then I would do 2 down, 2 up, 2 down, 2 up. Then I would go 4 down, 4 up, down, up. might be enough. And then I would just transition between, you know, I would just allow whatever wanted to happen. But I was shown that by a teacher years ago with the papillon, not the papillon, the carnival. You know, that moment from Carnival. Yeah. So she got me to do that down, 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 and then down, up, and then down, stay down, up, even though that's slightly artificial. Now I can hear some people out there, some of your viewers are going to be horrified by that because the positions look a little unnatural, but actually what happens is once you've gone through a whole bunch of strategic measurements of the wrist, then you can let it be free and it just worked a treat. Like you said earlier about the chaining, after half an hour of doing that with that carnival moment, it was just flying out of my hand. So I have found that very useful in many kind of passages, similar kind of passages where it's very easy to lock and to fix. So I just find that helps me to unlock and to stay
And would you
free.
do that in different tempi, I'm assuming? So starting slow, then doing it in a medium or a fast tempo, or are you mostly trying to translate a slow tempo and then do a short burst? Or do you do those 2 down, 2 up in a fast tempo as well, I assume? Is that correct?
Yes. Now, I'm a bit out of shape at the moment because I haven't been playing for a while. So, you know, I wouldn't want to sit here. I didn't know you were going to talk about this piece. Otherwise, I might have got it off the shelf and practiced it.
It's a personal obsession. I'm being selfish here. Sorry.
Oh, well, I mean, I quite like doing things like this, which you'd call it a rhythm, wouldn't you, really? But what it is, it's a long note followed by an impulse of 3 really quick notes, and then 5. So long note and then 5 rather than 3, and then 7. It's kind of a way of building up a trill as well, isn't it? If you've got a trill, so you start off with, and then so ever increasing groups.
Absolutely, yeah, that works beautifully.
I can remember when I was studying this piece, those Cortot style practice can be quite helpful, particularly the one on the top. You know, to go through some of that, it just brings attention to those fingers. That's yes. You also find that quite challenging. I suppose the trick in the end is not to listen to that hand.
Exactly. I remember when Babayan was when we were going over the double thirds, and it was quite weak at the time. It feels pretty good now, but he said the etude is not in the top hand, it's here. And I was like, oh yeah, oh, sure, okay. I mean, but I know what he's saying. You don't need to hear the busyness of it. And if you get caught up in that busyness, it can completely derail your technique because then you start exerting more force and things unravel. So thanks for humoring me with that.
Do you remember the wonderful Rubinstein story of when he was doing his debut, Carnegie Hall debut, and he played the Winter Wind study of Chopin, and he got the most fantastic reviews the next day. This was the interview, he was an old man confessing that he hadn't really bothered to learn the right hand, but he did a fantastic left hand. So he just sat there and belted out the left hand, and the right hand was doing whatever. And the critics, of course, were wonderful. But who is this fantastic pianist? He just made so much of the left hand that the right hand didn't matter. The right hand's an accompaniment anyway. How many pianists, myself included, who ever played that piece of, sat there for hours fixating on this hand, hardly even worrying about that. So I think what Babayan was doing is very similar to what Nina Svetlanova often used to do, which was to take the attention away from the difficult hand and put it so that all your listening was in the timing. Because to do what you just did there, it's a little moment of timing, which buys you a nanosecond.
And sometimes that's all you need. I mean, speaking of Winter Wind, I can make it to the end now. I've played that for so many years, and you're right. The longer I played that, you know, the lighter. And then even micro adjustments like, oh, I'm going to put a tiny bit more weight.
Yes.
I wouldn't necessarily teach that from the beginning. I'd do a more equalized approach, but that saves you even more energy. And it's really important for students to remember that. What textures sound too busy, and how can we minimize those to save energy? Because you hear, I think his name is, you know, Vadim Rudenko, or a modern pianist, Dmitry Shishkin, play the dreadful.
Yes.
And they're playing that at, you know, 190, and most pianists play it between, you know, 140 and 160. If I'm lucky, it's, you know, 140. It's so difficult. But how do they do that? And I was talking to a colleague recently, and he said, oh yes, they trained. He's like, I know what their teacher did. They just trained like that for so long that it became effortless. And then they add the chords. They don't, you know, learn the top and then add the chords. It's such, and that's the same thing with Winter Wind, although I don't think Winter Wind's quite as difficult in this manner. But after you get that so buttery in the right hand, you just let the left hand speak, and it's like, oh, it's finally feels so nice. So
yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
thank you for those points.
No, absolutely. I mean, yeah, the A minor, of course. I've got a few of Rubinstein's fingerings, because Anne Shine was a student of Rubinstein. He cheated. He took a tenth in the left hand. A couple other places where he just came over with the left hand and stole that. But yeah, I think that particular etude again is fantastic for practice, even if you can't get it up to the tempo, because it just does so much good for the hand. But again, like everything else, it has to be done well. Otherwise, if you're going to repeat something over and over and over, you risk injury, don't you? Especially with 4 and 5s.
Absolutely, like yeah. You can start to feel that after a while. And everyone on this channel, this is not a sport. I mean, I think it's bad even in sports, but you don't push through the pain with piano.
No,
you fix it.
Never. I mean, my secret for that is to close up the hand. So I would make sure my hand now are free and just go out quickly to get the underneath chord, rather than holding the hand in that position. So it would be losing the position, actually.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that technique. I've found that that's helped me a lot, actually. So sorry, we're getting off on my personal neuroses here. So let's get back to, we'll try to keep this to about an hour here. So maybe another 10 minutes of some of the techniques that you wish to share.
Right. Okay. Well, I was going to go into some elementary Etude Intelligente. I don't know if you can see this, by Piotr Lachert, which I think is really sweet. But if we've not got very much time, I think I'd rather leave that out and just go straight to something that I particularly like for the kind of intermediate and then up. Is this, can you see that? Vincent Persichetti, the Mirror Etude.
I love Persichetti. So underrated.
Yes, but I mean, do you use symmetrical inversion, Josh, in your practice or not?
Show me what you're talking about. Okay. Symmetrical inversion, maybe.
Right, it's where you use the mirror, the symmetry of the keyboard. You know, the keyboard's symmetrical from A flat outwards and from D. So the idea is, if you've got a particularly awkward passage in one hand, you make a mirror image of it in the other hand. Marc-André Hamelin practices like this. You can even see him do this on YouTube. So there's one spot that the Mendelssohn Variation Sérieuse.
I love it.
Which you play that one. There's a particular, that spot here. What I've done is literally to make a mirror of that in the other hand. So when I'm playing a major third in the right hand with 5 and 3, with a white and a black, I'm playing a major third in the left hand with 5 and 3, white and black. So in other words, it's an exact symmetrical inversion of. It doesn't always sound amazing, because you know it wasn't designed to be wasn't designed like that, but it's a fantastic way, because what happens is I'm engaging my left hand in exactly the same difficulty as the right hand. So the strengths of my left can aid and abet the weaknesses in my right, and vice versa. And I find that a particularly useful way of practicing, just extracting a difficult passage, like that thing you were talking about, and practicing it simultaneously in the left hand. Then if you're a believer in rhythms, you can sit there and do that as well. So I find this a really, really useful thing, to develop both hands equally. And these, Pesicchetti, they're called reflective keyboard studies. I don't know if your viewers can see that, if I hold it close up. You've got something here where you're sort of you're noodling around with an E major scale in the right hand, and a flat scale in the left hand. That's all it is. It's short like that with a little repeat in there.
So going back to the Mendelssohn, I mean, I know the next variation will give you some trouble, but can you expound on why you would do it? Why would you practice that? Is this a holistic technical regimen that you're trying to just equalize the hands, or do you find that it particularly helps you in the performance of that passage, and if so, why?
Very good question. You can only use it for the music of one hand, because what you're doing is you're making a mirror image of that music in the other hand. So I don't know if you can see that particular example. It's just one particular place I struggled with. So part of my practice plan was, I'd organized all the movements, the in-out movements, and so that I wasn't crowding in, and I was feeling comfortable. I was feeling still a little uncomfortable. So I just thought, well, what if I made a mirror and practiced both simultaneously? And I found that it worked wonders. If I didn't quite know what notes the left hand should be playing, it showed me that there was something about the material in the right hand that I wasn't quite clear on.
Interesting.
And it's
so psychologically could help, I'm sure, as well. Can you show us? I would be particularly interested in knowing how to find the. So you said it's symmetrical around A flat, or was it D?
D, yes. Okay. You know what? Because my blog is completely free, you don't have to pay anything for it. I can sort of say that I've got a post on my blog, practicingthepiano.com. Practicing spelt with an S, which is the English way. It's not a typo. Practicingthepiano.com. And if you go onto the blog there and search for symmetrical inversion, I've written 2 or 3 blog posts on the subject. But if I wanted to find the mirror for, say, a B flat, I could simply work out from my A flat. Okay, so B flat maps to G flat. I can put it in whichever octave I want, but it's more convenient to put it down there. D maps to a D.
Gotcha.
The G. Do you get the sense of it? So it feels to the body, to the brain, exactly the same. What I'm doing in this hand feels exactly the same, which is why I can practice that. Now I'm practicing it a little bit. It's starting to come back into my bones. I use it also if I'm struggling with memory for a particular passage. I'll just see if I can't make a mirror image of that. It can, as I say, it can only be in one hand. You can only mirror one, and you can't mirror unless you've got 4 hands. So that's
great. I think that's I don't know how many people watching this know that. And maybe you can clarify this for me. I've just heard rumors that for a time at Paris Conservatory, you had to play all Chopin etudes in every key or something, or that may have just been a rumor. But I always wondered, what is the purpose of that besides, having a perfect memory? But I think it can also, what you're alluding to here is doing this symmetry can make the primary hand realize certain aspects of intervals that you may not have considered before, which I would imagine with the transposition exercise that I was referring to would do the same thing.
Yeah,
Anything you'd like to add to that?
yes. I haven't played Mozart K453 for a number of years, but when I played it, I was sitting there for a few minutes. The orchestra's scratching away, and then you've got to come in with that nasty kind of flourish, and it was a bit scary. It was kind of, even though I knew it very well, I thought, well, I would practice that opening in every key with the fingering of G major. And when I got back to G major at the end, it felt like a breeze because I had experienced the same fingering, which you'd never finger it in E major the same way with 2-1. But I like 2-1. I find that stronger in the key of G. So it cements fingering. Cortot says in his after Opus 10 number 1, having mastered it, in the key of C, now play it in every other key using the fingerings of the key of C major.
Oh, geez.
Well, life's too short, isn't it, for that?
No kidding. Wow.
I like transposing so much for little passages, not whole pieces, and not at the speed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying that. That's something I've always wondered about. I knew it would be valuable for various reasons, but I could never pinpoint exactly why other than memory. And what you've just clarified, it really helps me, and I'm sure it will help everybody. So thank you very much.
Oh, it's a pleasure. We've probably run out of time, haven't we, Josh? I mean, I've got tons more we could do, but
let's maybe do one more, and then we'll call it good. If there's one more, because this is so great.
Well, there's something I think is very, very useful. Rather than sitting there playing etudes that might not actually help the piece. I mean, I think it was Marta Argerich that said that you can study octaves and play loads of octave etudes, but it's not going to necessarily help you with the octave passage in the particular piece you're playing. And that's a view I heartily subscribe to. But I do think you can make exercises up from pieces. I was, again, I'm trying to, after a day's teaching, just grab a middle section of something, but the Rachmaninoff
Yeah, absolutely.
So this person was struggling with the movement across from the, where it goes from here and then back again. She was struggling with that. So we just invented a little exercise where instead of, I see that as a rotation across to a 5, we did a little exercise where we went up, and once the movement is right, you can go forever with that, generating an exercise, looking down at the hand, then maybe a chromatic scale, so that you can get used to the angle on the different angle on the pinky and the black key. So I'm a great believer in inventing exercises from within the pieces rather than going outside of the piece and studying a whole bunch of different octave etudes that are usually quite boring and right. May not really help you very much in the end. So
absolutely. That's yeah, I completely agree with that. A lot of people think they have to do this 20 minutes a day of technique or 30 minutes or whatever it might be. But yes, if you're learning just the piano to start with, I think that's really wise, but apply different concepts to those, Hanon or scales or whatever you're doing, but then transcend as you go into your pieces, make exercises out of them. Thank you for reinforcing that. We've gone over that a lot on my channel, and that is something so important. A great place to end too, because I think that ties everything together nicely. You can, in order to overcome technical deficiencies, you have to get outside the box and stop drilling things and think about them in a creative new way. So, absolutely. And thank you for the tips. I mean, on my little crazy things, I'm going to go apply those right after this. So I really appreciate the time. We all do, Graham. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Tell us one more time your website and any other information you'd like to point my audience to.
Yeah, just visit practicingthepiano.com. When I say spelled correctly, spelled the English way, practising, thepiano, one word, .com. And there's my blogs, all my blog posts for years sitting there, and details of my online academy. Anything that we've talked about today is likely to be on the blog somewhere, the symmetrical inversion for sure. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I've had a great time chatting with you, Josh.
Absolutely.